I didn't tell anyone the day the keys slid across the cafe table and landed in my palm like a dare. The barista called out a latte with my name, and for a second, I forgot how to stand. The metal was warm from the title agent's hand. My own hands were colder than the cup. I smiled anyway. I'd spent 9 years saving, budgeting, and quietly saying no to vacations, no to impulse furniture, no to the raised eyebrows when I passed on bottomless brunch to max out my Roth. Now the result sat inside a small brass ring that chimed when I closed my fingers. My first house. Mine. I drove there alone, music low, windows cracked to the thin March sun. The neighborhood Maple Ridge was a quilt of old porches and big trees that dropped leaves like confetti every fall. My mother would call it too far, and my brother would ask, how far is far? And then they'd both recite miles like testimonies. But I'd chosen this place precisely because it was not close, not an extension of theirs. A 35-minute buffer between their opinions and my front door. The house was a 1920s colonial with scuffed hardwood floors and a bay window that bowed like it had been listening for a century. The inspector had said phrases like good bones and older systems, and I'd heard them both and still fallen in love. The lock turned easily, a soft click that sounded like permission. The air inside had that empty house smell, dust, old paint, a whisper of the prior owner's laundry soap. Light poured across the floorboards and made a bright island on the living room rug the last folks were kind enough to leave. I stood there, thinking of every room I'd ever shared, bedrooms without locks, dorms where my mother reorganized my drawers just to help, apartments my landlord could enter with a master key. This was different. This was a door I decided to open. The weight of that decision made my throat tight. I walked through in slow circles, narrating under my breath like I was training my body to believe me. This is the living room. This is where the couch goes. This is where you'll put the plants that always die under fluorescent office lights. I touched the archway to the dining room. I pressed my palm to the cool plaster like it might pulse back. In the kitchen, a little outdated but clean, I opened every cabinet. The hinges squeaked. I laughed. We'll fix you, I told them, as if the cabinets had been waiting for a voice. I set the keys on the kitchen counter, and because the moment demanded ritual, I uncorked the small bottle of sparkling wine my realtor, Sophia, mid-50s, sharp bob, high laugh lines that made you trust her, had tucked into a brown bag and slid into my tote as if she were handing me a secret. Every woman deserves a door that only she can open, she'd said, squeezing my shoulder. And yes, you're allowed to be proud. I poured into a mismatched mug, no glasses yet, and leaned against the counter, watching sunlight paint a gold square on the far wall. My phone vibrated with the family group chat, my mother sharing a soup recipe, my sister-in-law replying with heart emojis, my father adding a thumbs up, my brother asking if anyone had seen his drill. I typed, then erased, then typed again. Busy at work, can't chat. I hit send and set the phone face down. Guilt tried to worm its way in. Familiar and efficient. You should have told them. You should have let your mother come with, to make sure you're getting a fair price. You should have asked your father's opinion on interest rates, your brother's advice on lawn care, your aunt's thoughts on which neighborhoods are safe. I recognized the script. I'd grown up on it. In our house, privacy had been a suspicious word, like rebellion, but with better branding. Family has nothing to hide, my mother would say, opening a letter addressed to me because mail is just paper. Love is the law. She liked to tell a story about the day she found my diary on my pillow at 13, how she read it to keep me safe. She'd laugh at the end, soft and fond, as if safety came pre-packaged with mispronounced friends' names and underlined crushes. My father didn't laugh. He just didn't stop her. That was his role quiet permission. Once, after she'd straightened up my room and moved the shoebox where I kept notes from theater club, I sat on the curb with Mrs. Rankin, the neighbor with the giant hydrangeas and a voice like a radio host. She had a way of saying things that landed like seeds. Privacy is a gift you must fight for, she told me, squinting into the sun. Otherwise, the world takes it like loose change from a cup holder. I'd been 12, I pretended not to understand. But the sentence kept ringing, even now, decades later, in the quiet kitchen of a house, with my name on the deed. I carried the mug into the living room and sat cross-legged in the bright square. My jeans picked up dust. I didn't care. I listed what would go where. A soft sofa that didn't apologize. A bookshelf that didn't need to be alphabetized to earn respect. A mirror from the thrift store with a tarnished frame like a bruise. I decided on sage green for the walls, not because it matched anything, but because it matched me. Calm, a little stubborn, a color that didn't demand attention but kept it when it arrived. When the sun shifted, I walked to the front door and locked it twice, just to hear it. Not out of fear, out of ceremony, out of thanks, out of a promise to the girl who'd learned to whisper. "This is yours," I told her. "You don't have to ask permission to live here." Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere, a wind chime guessed at a tune. My phone buzzed again. "Mom, dinner Sunday? We could look at some listings near us after." I watched the message without opening it until the screen went dark. Then I set a paint sample on the windowsill, a small rectangle the color of a leaf that refuses to fall. I smiled, the kind that makes your cheeks ache. I was going to keep this secret. For now. Not forever. Just long enough to make the house speak my language before anyone else tried to translate. I lifted the keys, felt their weight, and slipped them into my pocket. They clinked like a promise. Growing up in the Taylor house meant knowing nothing was truly mine. Not my words, not my space, not even my silence. My mother believed love meant access, and she carried that belief like scripture. Our doors had no locks. She'd say, "We don't need them. Family doesn't keep secrets." But I knew even then it wasn't about secrets. It was about control. I remember the humiliation clearest in small flashes. 13 years old, coming home from school to find my diary cracked open on the kitchen counter. The little pink lock snapped like it was made of tissue. My mom sat across from it, sipping tea, flipping pages as if she were grading a paper. When I burst into tears, she looked at me with genuine confusion. "I need to know what's going on in your head, Emily. How else can I protect you?" That word protect was her shield. She wielded it every time I objected. When she opened my mail, "I need to protect you from scams." When she answered my phone, "I need to protect you from bad influences." Protection to her meant possession. And my father, ever the silent shadow, let her do it. He'd shrug, turn a page in his paper, maybe mutter, "Your mother just worries." That was the extent of his resistance. The dynamic only intensified when Daniel was born. I was 8, and suddenly the sun revolved around my baby brother. He was their miracle, the boy, after years of only me. He became the golden child overnight. The same scrutiny I endured was applied to him, but with sugar coating. Where my boundaries were suffocated, his were dressed up as attention. "He just needs more support," Mom would say whenever I noticed the disparity. If I wanted less oversight, I was selfish. If he wanted more, he was cherished. So I adjusted. I learned to live smaller, quieter, to hide the important things not in journals or shoeboxes, those could be found, but inside myself. I stopped asking for privacy. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped believing I was entitled to either. Our extended family only reinforced the message. At every holiday gathering, my aunts would shake their heads if I asked for space. "Don't be dramatic, Em. Your mother just cares." They'd laugh when she told the diary story, like it was cute, a mother's love too big for locks. That laughter taught me as much as my mother's actions did. If I pushed back, I'd be painted as sensitive, ungrateful, difficult. It worked. For years, I buried my resentment under compliance. But resentment has a way of fermenting, of becoming sharper with age. By high school, I stopped bringing friends home. It was too embarrassing watching my mom interrogate them about their grades, their families, their life goals, like a detective with a badge she'd given herself. I noticed the way my friends looked at me, pity, discomfort, and I hated it. And yet, part of me still wanted her approval. That contradiction defined my adolescence, wanting distance but craving the very love that smothered me. My father would occasionally throw me a bone, take me for ice cream, ask about my classes, but he never challenged her rules. His quiet passivity taught me another lesson. Sometimes the absence of defense hurts worse than outright control. Looking back, I see how the seeds of my secrecy were planted in those years. Every boundary I tried to set was bulldozed. Every attempt at independence was framed as rebellion. Privacy became a currency I couldn't afford. So I learned the only way to have anything for myself was to guard it like a thief. And that's why, decades later, when I held the keys to my first house, I didn't tell them. Not yet. Not because I didn't love my family, but because I knew love, in their language, meant forfeiting ownership of my own life. College was supposed to be my escape. 4 hours away felt like a lifetime when I packed my bags and hauled them into a dorm that smelled of paint and popcorn. For the first time, no one stood in the doorway asking where I was going or when I'd be back. I could eat pizza for breakfast, skip a shower, or pull an all-nighter without anyone hovering. Those first weeks tasted like air after holding my breath for years. But freedom in my family never came without strings. By midterms, my mother had already found a way to thread herself back into my life. She befriended my resident advisor, of all people, showing up with cookies and a smile that masked her interrogation. Soon she was calling me with updates about how messy my roommate was, how often I went out, even which professors she'd heard were too demanding. She visited twice a month, each time armed with Tupperware and a broom, cleaning my side of the room until it looked like a showroom. To anyone else, it was kindness. To me, it was surveillance. I remember one night, sitting cross-legged on my dorm bed. My roommate Zoe sprawled across her desk chair. She looked at me with wide, amused eyes and said, "Emily, your mom treats this place like it's hers." I laughed it off, but deep down, it stung. Because Zoe was right, and I had no idea how to stop it. That pattern followed me long after graduation. When I landed a job offer in Chicago, everything I'd been working toward, a position with growth and excitement, I almost said yes. Almost. Then the calls began. My mom sobbing about crime in big cities, my dad muttering about how expensive moving would be, my brother reminding me, family stays together. I lasted a week before I broke. I turned down the offer and accepted a safer, closer job at a financial firm in my hometown. At first, I told myself it wasn't defeat. The pay was good, the office respectable, and my parents proud. But deep down, I knew I had chosen their comfort over my freedom. Again, the compromise bled into my adult life. I rented an apartment 15 minutes away, close enough to keep Sunday dinners inevitable. Every time I hinted at wanting more distance, the guilt campaign launched. Who would bring me soup when I got sick? Who would check if I didn't answer the phone? Who would make sure I wasn't lonely? I had no answer, except the truth I could never say aloud. I'd rather be lonely on my own terms than smothered on theirs. There were small moments that cracked the illusion, though, like during a brief college romance with a boy named Ryan. He wasn't serious, more laughter and late-night pizza than anything long-term. One night, he saw my mother's name flash on my phone for the third time in an hour and raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot," he said carefully. I jumped to defend her, repeating the script about how she just worried, how she only wanted what was best. He didn't argue, just nodded slowly. Months later, after we drifted apart, his words echoed in my head. "That's a lot." And he was right. I ignored those cracks for years, convincing myself this was just how family worked. But quietly, I started saving. Aggressively. I maxed my retirement accounts, lived below my means, turned down trips and dinners. People assumed I was frugal. I knew it was something else. Every dollar was a brick in the wall I was building between their control and my freedom. The cost of freedom was steep. It meant missing out on experiences my friends took for granted. It meant enduring the label of boring or too careful. But I didn't care. I knew someday those sacrifices would add up to something bigger, a place no one else could touch, a space they couldn't enter unless I chose to open the door. What I didn't realize then was that the cost wouldn't just be financial. It would also mean paying in guilt, in conflict, in the rupture of ties I once thought unbreakable. But at that point, all I could see was the prize at the end of the tunnel. My own front door, my own lock, my own life. By the time I turned 30, I had stopped waiting for permission. I finally understood that freedom wasn't something my family would ever hand me wrapped in approval. It had to be claimed, like stolen treasure. That realization hardened into resolve with every suggestion my mother sent my way. She forwarded Zillow listings 3 blocks from their house, texted me photos of homes with the caption, "Just imagine the kids running here someday." It was meant as encouragement. To me, it sounded like a cage. So I made a decision. I would search in secret. I invented a cover story, an evening financial planning course at the local community college. Twice a week, I packed my laptop, kissed my family, chat goodbye with a quick off to class, and drove across town. But instead of lectures and PowerPoints, I was slipping into quiet houses with for sale signs in their yards, walking with realtors through kitchens where no one knew my name. My mother thought I was learning retirement strategies. In a way, she was right. I was planning for a life of my own. The secrecy wore on me. At lunch breaks, I whispered to mortgage brokers in the corner of the office cafe, heart pounding as though I were planning a crime. I deleted browsing history, switched between email accounts, stashed pre-approval letters in the bottom drawer of my desk at work. I'd grown up knowing how to hide, and now I was using those old skills for something more than survival. But secrecy also left me with no one to lean on. Every choice, from neighborhood to roof repairs, rested solely on me. Some nights I lay awake, phone glowing in the dark, wondering if I was being ridiculous. Was I really so different from other daughters? Maybe my mother's help wasn't a violation, maybe I was just ungrateful. That doubt gnawed at me, until the next time she helped. Like the day she stopped by my apartment unannounced with a casserole and casually mentioned, "By the way, I peeked at your mail, your credit card bill was sitting there. You're paying too much for dining out, Emily." I laughed weakly, but inside, something clicked into place. This wasn't love. This was surveillance dressed in motherly concern. And I couldn't keep living inside it. Sophia, my realtor, became my lifeline. She was in her 50s, with a sharp laugh and a way of looking at me that felt like both a dare and a hug. I didn't spill every detail, but she didn't need me to. After a month of house hunting together, she shook her head gently one evening and said, "You don't have to apologize for wanting space. People who love you will learn to respect it. People who don't, well, that tells you all you need to know." Her words settled in me like an anchor. For the first time, I felt seen, not as the oversensitive daughter, not as the family's reluctant shadow, but as a woman who had every right to draw a line in the sand. From then on, my search had a new edge. I wasn't just looking for square footage or school districts. I was hunting for proof that I could choose myself and survive the fallout. The house wasn't perfect. The inspector's list ran long. An aging roof, outlets that hummed faintly, windows that sighed when you pulled them shut. But when I walked through the door that first afternoon, none of that mattered. It felt like the walls exhaled, and for once, I could breathe with them. The Colonial stood on a quiet street framed by maple trees whose branches bent like arches overhead. The bay window in the living room spilled light across the floorboards, turning dust into sparks. The backyard, modest but private, had a square of soil just begging for herbs and flowers. I knew immediately I would plant rosemary for resilience, lavender for peace. Every detail seemed to answer something I hadn't realized I'd been asking. The creak of the stairs reminded me of the bedtime rituals I'd craved but never had. Privacy, safety, belonging. The tiny garden shed out back looked like it could guard more than Rake's secrets, maybe, or dreams too fragile to leave in plain sight. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning, telling my office I had a doctor's appointment. The notary slid the final contract across the cafe table. My hand shook, but when the pen touched paper, it steadied. When I looked up, Sophia, my realtor, was smiling. "This is it, Emily. Your space, on your terms." Those words echoed as I crossed the threshold alone, clutching the keys. I set down the first cardboard box in the entryway and whispered, "We made it." No one else was there to hear, but maybe the house understood. I started moving in quietly, load by load. A trunk of books one weekend, a single armchair the next. I kept the apartment staged, just in case my mother decided to drop by. Every time I unlocked the door of the new house, I felt a jolt, half guilt, half triumph. Decorating became a rebellion. I painted the living room walls a shade of sage green my mother would have dismissed as dull. I arranged my books by color, not author, just because it made me smile. I hung art prints I'd collected for years, but never dared to put up in my apartment. They were mine, abstract, messy, bold, pieces that spoke to me, not to anyone else. Each choice was tiny, almost laughable on its own, but together they formed a declaration. I am allowed to decide. I am allowed to exist without an audience. On Saturdays, I spent hours in the garden, digging into earth that still smelled of winter. Grace, my neighbor with a no-nonsense voice and a heart of gold, leaned over the fence one afternoon. "Plant lavender along the walkway," she advised. "It'll remind you every day this is your home. Make it smell like you, not anyone else." Her words sank deeper than she knew. For years, my spaces had always smelled like someone else. My mother's perfume, my father's aftershave, the constant swirl of a household where nothing belonged solely to me. Now, the air carried my fingerprints. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept back in. Sitting cross-legged in the empty dining room, I'd imagine my family's reaction. Would they be proud? Or would they dissect my choices, complain about the cabinets, dismiss the neighborhood as too far? I didn't know, and I wasn't ready to find out. So I held the secret close, tending to it the way you guard a flame on a windy night. Each brushstroke on the walls, each herb planted in the garden, each book placed on a shelf was fuel. Proof that this dream was real. Proof that, finally, I had built something entirely mine. For weeks, I lived like a woman with two shadows. In the apartment, I played the role my family expected. Dependable daughter, loyal sister, ever within reach. I kept the place exactly as they'd last seen it, down to the stack of unopened mail on the counter, just in case someone decided to drop by. My mother would comment, "I like how you've kept everything neat," and I'd smile, knowing she had no idea I was barely there anymore. But at the house, my house, I was alive in a way I'd never been before. There, I painted late into the night, my phone on silent, the scent of sage green walls wrapping me like a blanket. I'd sit in the bay window with tea, watching the street lamps flicker, savoring the strange quiet of belonging only to myself. Every nail I hammered, every picture I hung was a secret victory. It felt like I was straddling two worlds, one of duty, one of choice. I lied about being busy at work to skip Sunday dinners so I could assemble a bookshelf or test recipes in my little kitchen. I told my mom I was taking extra projects when, in reality, I was kneeling in my garden, pressing rosemary into the soil. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that I could make choices without permission. Still, guilt lingered like a draft under the door. Sometimes, while setting up a lamp or stacking dishes in the cupboard, I'd picture my mother's face if she found out. She would claim hurt, confusion, betrayal. My father would sigh, disappointed but silent. Daniel would roll his eyes and mutter something about me being dramatic. And the cycle would start again. Me apologizing, them reasserting control. The fear of that moment made me guard the secret fiercely. Then there was Grace. My neighbor had a garden that put mine to shame, neat rows of tomatoes and flowers that thrived under her care. She was a retired teacher, the type who could silence a room with one arched brow. One evening, as I wrestled with a stubborn bag of soil, she appeared at the fence, arms folded. "You're new here," she said, more statement than question. "Yes," I answered cautiously, brushing dirt from my hands. She studied me for a long moment, then tilted her head. "You got people you're keeping this place from?" I froze. Had she seen something? Had I been too obvious sneaking boxes in at night? She softened, sensing my alarm. "Don't worry. I've seen it before. Some families don't see homes, they see extensions of themselves. Hardest lesson you'll ever learn is this. If you want a space to stay yours, you've got to defend it. Otherwise, it gets swallowed up." Her words hit like a bell. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. After she went back inside, I sat on my porch steps until the stars came out, rolling her words around in my head. Defend it. Not just buy it, not just paint it, but fight for it. That night, as I turned the lock on my front door, I whispered to the empty hallway, "You're mine, and I'll keep it that way." I didn't realize how soon those words would be tested. It was a Wednesday, one of those mid-spring afternoons where the air feels soft with possibility. My client meeting had been canceled last minute, so instead of trudging back to the apartment to keep up appearances, I decided to spend the unexpected gift of time at my house. I was practically humming with anticipation, planning to finally hang the antique mirror I'd found, maybe rearrange the kitchen cabinets so they made sense to me. But as I turned onto my street, my stomach dropped. 3 cars sat in my driveway. My mother's silver SUV, my brother Daniel's wife Melissa's blue Honda, and a red compact I didn't recognize. I slowed, then drove past, heart pounding in my throat. There was no mistaking it, they were at my house. I circled the block, trying to convince myself it was some mistake, that maybe they were visiting a neighbor. But when I came around again, I caught movement through the bay window. Figures inside, my figures, my space. I parked around the corner, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys. Ducking low, I crept along the hedges until I reached the side of the house. Voices drifted out through an open dining room window. My mother's voice rang loudest, bright and confident, like a tour guide. look at this crown molding, it's original. Emily doesn't realize how lucky she is to have found such character in this market. I froze, bile rising. She was giving a tour. My house. My private, hard-earned sanctuary. Treated like a family attraction. Melissa chimed in. It's nice, but the kitchen's dated. Those cabinets would have to go. And the counters? My mother agreed. We'll help her renovate. William and I were thinking of giving her money for her birthday. This place isn't functional for entertaining. Entertaining. My chest burned. I hadn't bought this house to host barbecues or Sunday dinners. I'd bought it to be mine, finally, after decades of living under someone else's roof. Then another voice, smooth, unfamiliar, feminine. With navy walls, this dining room would look stunning. Don't you think, Janet? That must have been the woman with the red compact. Olivia, I'd later learn. A stranger, walking through my house, critiquing my choices as if she were flipping through a magazine spread. They moved into the kitchen, their voices muffled. I crept to another window and caught the words just in time. How much did she pay? Olivia asked casually. Just under 300. My mother answered without hesitation, like she was announcing the weather. She had a decent down payment, but still too much, if you ask me. Wheel backed. My body went cold. Not only did she know the exact purchase price, she was handing that information to someone I'd never even met. My financial life. Something I had guarded so carefully was being broadcast in my own kitchen. And then Melissa again. The backyard is perfect for summer cookouts. Daniel could bring the grill. I gripped the siding of the house until my knuckles ached. They were carving up my dream, turning it into theirs, making plans to inhabit a space that wasn't theirs to touch. For nearly an hour, I crouched outside, listening as they toured every room. They critiqued my walls, plotted drapes, mapped out where the kids could play once Daniel and Melissa started their family. Not once did they pause to ask if this was what I wanted. It wasn't about me, it was about them. When they finally emerged, I peeked from behind the tree just in time to see my mother lock the front door with a key I had never given her. The sight made my knees buckle. My sanctuary had been breached long before I even knew it. They laughed lightly, chatting as they walked to their cars, blissfully unaware of the storm they had unleashed inside me. The moment their cars disappeared down the street, I sprinted to the front door, shoved it open, and stepped into air thick with my mother's perfume. My house smelled like her. My chest constricted, rage and grief tangling until I could barely breathe. That's when I knew. Whatever line I thought I was drawing before, it wasn't nearly enough. This wasn't just about owning a house. It was about whether I could own myself. I didn't even wait to take off my coat before calling a locksmith. My hands shook as I explained over the phone, emergency lock change as soon as possible. When the young technician arrived 45 minutes later, he assumed I'd been robbed. Break-in? He asked casually, setting his toolbox down. I hesitated. Something like that, I murmured, too ashamed to explain the intruders were people who claimed to love me. As the locks were swapped out one by one, my phone lit up with call after call from my mother. I ignored the first, then the second, then the third. On the fourth, I answered, stepping onto the back patio to keep my fury from bouncing off the new walls I'd so carefully claimed. Emily, she snapped. I tried to stop by again and my key doesn't work. Did you change the locks? Her voice was full of indignation, as if she were the wronged party. Yes, I said evenly, though my pulse raced. And would you like to explain why you had a key in the first place? Or why you thought it was acceptable to bring Melissa and a stranger into my home without permission? There was a silence. Then the familiar sound of my mother's composure shifting gears from startled to righteous in the space of a breath. I don't know why you're upset. I was proud of you, Emily. I wanted to show Melissa and Olivia your beautiful house. Olivia is an interior designer. She had such wonderful ideas for your space. That's not the point, my voice cracked. You did not have permission. You never had permission. You're overreacting, she said flatly, sliding into her favorite refrain. Family doesn't need permission. And that was the crux of it. In her world, love meant entitlement. To her, locks were suggestions. The conversation ended with me trembling, angrier than I'd ever let myself be. But I didn't even have a moment to process before my door rattled again, this time from pounding fists. Daniel. Emily, open up! His voice was sharp, the voice he saved for arguments he thought he'd already won. I opened the door just enough to leave the chain across. What the hell did you say to Mom? He demanded, cheeks flushed. She's at home crying because of you. Hello to you too, Daniel, I replied coolly. I assume she called you immediately after our conversation. Of course she did. She's devastated. How could you accuse her of violating your privacy when all she was trying to do was help you? I studied his face. Did he really not see it? Or was loyalty to mom stronger than logic? Did she tell you she made a copy of my key without my knowledge? Did she tell you she walked through my house like it was hers? That she shared my private finances with a stranger? A flicker of doubt crossed his features. Quickly, he buried it. She was excited for you. She wanted to help make your house a home. It already is my home, I said quietly. Mine. Not hers, not yours, not Melissa's. Mine. His jaw tightened. You've always been like this. So selfish. Boundaries. You throw that word around like it excuses everything. Family is supposed to be involved in each other's lives. That's love. No, I whispered, my hands trembling but steadying on the frame. That's control. Love would have been waiting until I invited you in. He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head, muttering, Fine. Have your precious space. Don't come crying to us when you realize how lonely it is up on your high horse. He stormed off, leaving tire marks on the street. Within hours, the texts began. Guilt-laden messages from aunts, cousins, even my father, all siding with my mother, all painting me as the villain. Alone in my house that night, tea cooling in my hands, I understood something chilling. This wasn't just a battle over locks. This was a battle over narrative. And my family had already started rewriting mine. The silence came first. A deafening quiet that spread through the family group chat like frost. Suddenly, I wasn't tagged in dinner reminders. Photos of my nephew's soccer games went out without my name included. It was as if someone had quietly edited me out of the script. But silence was just the opening act. Soon, the guilt arrived packaged, literally, on my front porch. A wicker basket wrapped in cellophane with a bow the color of dried blood. Inside, burgundy curtains my mother once insisted would elevate my bedroom. Towels in a shade of green I'd never choose. Framed family photos I had deliberately left behind at the apartment. The card read, Family always forgives. Dinner at 5:30. Love, Mom. I carried the basket straight to my car and returned it to their porch that night with my own note. Thank you, but I've already chosen decor that suits my taste. I won't be at Sunday dinner. I hope someday you understand why this hurt me. The next move was subtler and more dangerous. A coworker, Alyssa, pulled me aside one afternoon. Your mom bumped into me at the store, she said cautiously. She asked if you'd been acting strangely at work, said you'd been isolating yourself. My stomach clenched. My mother wasn't just recruiting family to her cause, she was shaping my image in the wider world. Concern disguised as gossip, love repackaged as doubt. Then came the weaponization of health. Aunt Susan called, voice dripping with concern. Your mother's not sleeping, Emily. Her blood pressure's up. She says the stress of your distance is affecting her health. The implication was clear. I was making my mother sick. That if I loved her, I'd stop this nonsense and hand over my keys figuratively, if not literally. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. But the truth was, it hurt. I sat in my car after that call, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, feeling like the villain in my own story. That's what manipulation does. It makes you doubt your own reality. So I fought back in the only way I could, with locks and cameras. I hired a security company to install motion lights, a video doorbell, sensors on every entry point. As Diego, the technician, walked me through the system, he asked if I'd had break-ins. I almost told him the truth that the intruders carried casseroles instead of crowbars. But I just smiled tightly and said, something like that. At night, I'd watch the camera feed on my phone, equal parts comforted and horrified. Comforted because I knew no one could slip inside unseen. Horrified because it had come to this protecting myself from my own family. The exile deepened as holidays approached. Thanksgiving had always been non-negotiable, a ritual that demanded attendance. My father called, his voice stiff. Your mother set a place for you. Dinner at 3. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I closed my eyes, breathing in. I won't be there, Dad. Silence stretched across the line. Finally, he said, I don't recognize you anymore. That one cut deeper than all the others, because he was right, in a way. I wasn't the daughter who bent until she broke anymore. I was someone new, someone with a lock she controlled. As I hung up, a strange thought flickered. Maybe being unrecognizable wasn't the tragedy he thought. Maybe it was the point. That night, I sat at my dining table, the same one my mother had critiqued for not being fit for entertaining, with a plate of simple pasta and a glass of wine. Alone, yes, but also free. And for the first time, I wondered if loneliness might not be the enemy after all. Maybe it was just the quiet sound of healing. I didn't plan on therapy. For years, I had carried the label of too sensitive stamped onto me like a warning sign. Therapy, in my family's language, was for people who couldn't handle life on their own. But after weeks of second-guessing myself, lying awake, replaying arguments, questioning if I was the one who had gone too far, I knew I needed a voice that wasn't part of the Taylor echo chamber. That's how I found Dr. Harper. Her office was small, with walls painted a soft blue and shelves filled with plants that looked healthier than most people I knew. The first time I sat across from her, I didn't know where to begin. Words tangled in my throat. Finally, I blurted, "My mom copied my house key without asking." "It's Bay." Her eyebrows lifted, but not in judgment, more like recognition. "How did that make you feel?" I laughed. A short, bitter sound. Violated. Betrayed. But also guilty. Like I'm the one breaking some unspoken rule. She leaned forward slightly. "That guilt is familiar, isn't it? Not new." It wasn't. We spent weeks untangling that knot, tracing it back through years of blurred boundaries. She called it enmeshment, a word that felt clinical but also freeing. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern, a system, and the act of setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was survival. What you're experiencing, Dr. Harper explained, is a predictable response to boundary setting with people who've never had to respect boundaries before. They'll escalate, recruit others, even rewrite the story. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the boundary is working. Those words steadied me. For the first time, I felt less like a selfish daughter and more like a woman learning to breathe. Outside of therapy, I started building something my family had never taught me to value: chosen support. Sophia, my realtor, became more than a professional contact. She'd call just to check in, her laugh warm through the phone. "How's the sage wall looking? Still smug?" she'd tease. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to acknowledge my victories, however small, without trying to claim them. Then there was Grace, my neighbor. She had a way of showing up at just the right moment, appearing with a basket of tomatoes from her garden, or standing at the fence with advice about soil or paint. "Don't let anyone tell you what shade your life should be," she said once, glancing at my newly painted shutters. It was a comment about color, sure, but also about something bigger. At work, a coworker named Damon invited me to join his group's weekly game nights. Board games, pizza, laughter that wasn't laced with obligation. The first night, I nearly cried driving home, not because anything monumental had happened, but because I realized how light friendship could feel when it wasn't tethered to guilt. Piece by piece, I was replacing the scaffolding my family had built with one of my own design. These allies weren't bound by blood, but by respect. They didn't need my keys to prove their care. They didn't question my need for space. They simply honored it. And maybe that was the most radical truth of all. The people who love you don't demand access. They wait for the invitation. It was late October when Daniel showed up at my doorstep, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, the bravado I'd come to expect from him noticeably absent. For a moment, I thought he was there to deliver another lecture on family loyalty. Instead, he said quietly, "Can we talk?" I let him in, wary. He lingered in the entryway, eyes flicking over the sage walls and the gallery of art I'd hung, things he had never seen before. "Your place looks nice," he admitted, settling awkwardly on the edge of the sofa. "Different, but nice." We sat in silence until he finally exhaled. "I owe you an apology." The words startled me. Daniel had always been the golden child, the one who never needed to apologize because the family script painted him as blameless. "For what?" I asked carefully. He rubbed his forehead as if trying to dislodge the words. "Melissa caught Mom going through her things. Her journal, some work papers. At first we thought maybe we misplaced them, but then Mom started mentioning details she couldn't have known unless she'd been reading them." His voice dropped. "It was the same thing she used to do to you, wasn't it?" I felt the air rush out of me. Years of gaslighting, of being told I was too sensitive, collapsed into that single moment of validation. "Yes," I whispered, "exactly the same." He nodded, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. When Melissa confronted her, Mom said it was just love, that she needed to know what was happening to support us better. Melissa was furious. Told me if I didn't change the locks, she was moving out. He laughed, humorless. And I realized I was ready to protect my wife's privacy immediately. But when you did the same thing, I attacked you for it. Hearing him say it out loud was like touching a wound I'd carried for years. Part of me wanted to rage at him for only believing me once it happened to him. Another part softened finally. Someone in the family saw the truth. Because you were taught to see me as the overreactor, I said. I was raised to accept mom's intrusions as love. You were raised to see my resistance as rebellion. Daniel's eyes met mine, vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to. I'm sorry, Emily. I should have been a better brother. We talked for hours that night, really talked, not the shallow exchanges we usually had at family dinners. He admitted the pressure of being the favorite, the unspoken expectation to always shine. I admitted how isolating it felt to be cast as the difficult one. For the first time, we weren't the golden child and the scapegoat. We were just siblings, comparing scars. When he left, the rift between us wasn't magically healed, but something new had taken root. The possibility of rebuilding on mutual respect, not family mythology. 2 weeks after Daniel's unexpected visit, I agreed to something I never thought I'd do. Meet my parents in a neutral space, with a mediator present. It felt almost absurd, like I was walking into a business negotiation instead of a family conversation. But maybe that was the point. For once, this wouldn't be about guilt or tears or raised voices. It would be about structure. The coffee shop smelled of roasted beans and rain-soaked coats. I chose a table tucked in the corner where I could see the door. My stomach clenched when my parents walked in. My mother clutched her latte like armor, lips pursed, her posture stiff. My father followed, steady but distant, as if already bracing himself for impact, the mediator. Ela, a calm woman with glasses and a voice that carried the weight of fairness, sat between us. Thank you all for being here, Ela began. This is an opportunity to listen and to be heard. Emily, would you like to share what you hope to gain today? I'd rehearsed with Dr. Harper, but my throat still tightened. I love you both, I said, looking from one face to the other. I miss having you in my life. But for us to rebuild trust, I need acknowledgement. Copying my key, entering my home without permission, sharing my finances, those things were wrong. And I need commitments about respecting boundaries going forward. It's big. The words landed in silence. My mother blinked rapidly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her jaw stayed clenched. My father looked at me, then at Ela, then at my mother, his hand twitching like he wanted to reach across the table. I never meant to hurt you, my mother finally said, her voice brittle. Everything was out of love, out of concern. I braced myself for the familiar script, the justification, the minimization, the quiet manipulation. But then something shifted. My father placed his hand over hers and spoke with a firmness I'd rarely heard. Janet, I think what Emily needs isn't an explanation. She needs acknowledgement. My mother turned to him, startled, as though he'd broken a decades-old contract. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then she sighed, a sound so heavy it seemed to drag her shoulders down. You're right, she whispered, first to him, then to me. You're right, Emily. I should not have entered your home. I should not have made a copy of your key. I was wrong. For a heartbeat, I couldn't process it. The words I'd begged to hear my whole life I was wrong were finally spoken. My chest loosened, a knot I'd carried for decades, unraveling just enough for air to rush in. Thank you, I said quietly. That means more than you know. The rest of the meeting wasn't neat or simple. Old habits surfaced, my mother veering into defensiveness, my father attempting to smooth tension, but Ela kept us steady. By the end, we drafted small agreements. My parents would text before visiting and wait for confirmation. They would not share my personal information with others. I, in turn, would maintain contact through calls and occasional meals, honest about my limits instead of disappearing into silence. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in a bow, but it was a start. As we stood to leave, my father did something he hadn't done in years. He hugged me, not the perfunctory side hug of obligation, but a real embrace. He leaned close and whispered, I'm proud of you, for standing up, for becoming who you are. Tears blurred my vision. Not everything was healed, but for the first time I believed healing was possible. Healing wasn't linear. After that coffee shop meeting, the air between us felt less like glass about to shatter and more like ice just starting to thaw. Fragile, but shifting. My mother surprised me by actually following through, at least at first. She would text before visiting, short and clipped. Can I stop by at 4? Sometimes I said yes, sometimes I said no. The real miracle was that she respected the answer either way. The first dinner we shared after the mediation felt like walking on eggshells. She sat at my table, eyes roving over every choice, the sage walls, the mismatched art, the books by color. I braced for commentary. Instead, she set down her fork and said, I never would have chosen this color for your living room, but I have to admit, it suits you. It was small, almost begrudging, but it was monumental for me, a sliver of acknowledgement that my decisions could stand without her approval. Dad was quieter, though different too. Without the burden of keeping peace between us, he began finding his own voice. We started having one-on-one conversations about work, about history, about architecture, things he'd always loved but rarely shared. I realized I was getting to know him for the first time, not as Mom's echo, but as himself. And Daniel, our dynamic shifted the most. We weren't magically bonded, but we'd begun to peel back years of resentment. He'd call sometimes, just to ask how my week was, without slipping into judgment. He admitted more than once, I'm still unlearning some things. Hearing him say that owning the process meant more than any apology. Even Melissa surprised me. Months after the lock incident, she invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. I owe you an apology, she said immediately, eyes steady. I should never have walked through your house without your permission. At the time, I didn't see the problem. My family has always treated houses like communal spaces. But that doesn't excuse it. Your boundaries are valid. Her directness disarmed me. For the first time, our connection wasn't filtered through family dynamics. It was simply two women, acknowledging harm and moving forward. Still, the adjustment wasn't seamless. There were backslides. A few times, Mom forgot and showed up unannounced, casserole in hand, rehearsing the old excuse, I was just worried. But now I had the words and the strength to stop her at the door. Mom, I love you, but we agreed on boundaries. Call first. She'd pout, sometimes argue, but eventually leave. And each time I felt steadier, less guilty for defending my own space. Slowly, family gatherings became less like battlefields and more like cautious truces. For Dad's birthday, I hosted a small dinner on my terms, with a clear start and end time. We laughed. We ate. And when they left at 9 sharp, I closed the door and realized something stunning. I wasn't exhausted. For the first time in years, family didn't drain me. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't the storybook family I'd once fantasized about, but it was progress. And progress, I learned, is enough. Spring bled into summer, and then autumn rolled in, painting Maple Ridge in amber and gold. With each season, my life took on a new rhythm, one that didn't orbit my family's gravity but spun on its own axis. At first, every boundary I held felt like lifting a weight heavier than I could carry. Saying, no, that doesn't work for me, left me sweating, heart racing, as though I'd committed some unforgivable crime. But repetition built muscle. Over time, the words came easier, smoother, like stepping stones across a river I once thought uncrossable. The security cameras stayed. Not because I expected another break-in, but because they gave me peace of mind. I'd glance at the live feed when I felt old panic rising, reminding myself, the locks are mine. The doors are mine. The choice of who enters is mine. Family gatherings became tolerable. For Dad's birthday, I hosted a small dinner, just 4 of us, with clear start and end times. To my surprise, everyone respected the boundaries. We ate, we laughed, we reminisced without veering into criticism or intrusion. When they left right on time, I leaned against the closed door and realized I wasn't drained. For once, I'd shared space with my family and walked away intact. Melissa reached out more often too, and not because of Daniel. She'd text me about books, send me recipes she thought I'd like, even invite me for walks in the park. Our connection shifted from polite obligation to genuine friendship. She admitted once over coffee, when I first married into this family, I thought the closeness was beautiful. Now I see how suffocating it can be. I wish I'd noticed sooner. Daniel, to his credit, kept trying. Some days, he stumbled slipping into the old script of defending Mom, but other days, he surprised me. He'd say things like, I told Mom no when she asked for our garage code, and I could tell he was as startled by his own defiance as I was proud of it. Mom remained the hardest. There were moments when I thought we were making progress, when she'd ask instead of assume, when she'd listen instead of lecture. But then, like muscle memory, she'd backslide. A surprise visit here, a guilt-laden sigh there. Each time I had to steady myself, remind her of our agreements, remind myself I wasn't cruel for holding the line. Dr. Harper's voice echoed in my head on those days. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks and you hold the key. You decide who comes in, when, and under what terms. The metaphor carried me through the rough patches, because even when my family stumbled or resisted, the difference was that I no longer folded. One evening in early spring, I sat on my patio, sipping tea while the scent of rosemary and lavender drifted around me. The same patio where, a year earlier, I'd hidden behind a tree, watching my family carve up my future. Now, it was mine. Quiet, unshared, sacred. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who lived on apologies and compliance, who mistook control for love. I wanted to tell her, it gets better, you get stronger, and one day you'll sit in your own garden, on your own terms, and breathe without permission. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But for the first time, the life I was living felt like it belonged to me.